So at face value, the title, how is AI going to impact the world, the workplace and our societies? It doesn't seem like there's a business value there. But when you look back on how companies operate, they operate within an ecosystem, a community. So showing how AI is going to impact the community definitely has a business value. And also showing how AI is going to impact the workplace and what people do. And since companies need people in order to do anything, that also ties it back to the business value there. So just wanted to clarify it so if you don't think it's going to be a fugazi talk. As a quick background, I was ex-head of AI for Citigroup, one of the heads of AI for United Health Group, one of the world's biggest healthcare companies. And today I run the AI program at Autonomous, which is an alternative investments company, one of the biggest in the world today. So just as a basic flow, I want to keep it very basic. And then if you have questions at the end, please ask, because there's so many questions around AI. But just to start off, I wanted to explain a little bit why we've been brought up to think that we are robots and we need to be robots. Really, when the Second World War ended, people came back, they needed jobs. At that time, Ford Motor Company was doing extremely well. It was one of the first real examples of mass production line, robotic, human-like work. Everybody would have a certain piece to put into the car, a certain thing to fix, a certain thing to put into place. And they created a real kind of robotic assembly line. All the other car manufacturers, which was one of the biggest industries at the time, started adopting the same thing as well. Toyota Motor Company started doing the same thing, etc. And that really drove a culture of getting more out of people. How can we get a person to do more and behave like a robot? If they do things 400 times in a day, how can we get them to do 450, 480, etc.? So as these people came into the workplace, started working, providing for their families again, they naturally came into the baby boomer era. They started impacting, of course, Generation X. Cementing into people's heads and their children's heads that you got to clock in, you got to do exactly what your boss tells you to do. If you want to be worthy of your job, you got to go the extra mile. Your work really defined you. Work still defines you today, but it's people do have hobbies, people do have a life as well. Back in that generation, it was really, really important what you do. And being an engineer or a doctor or something of the sort was the epiphany of where could you go in life, as well as being an entrepreneur. But getting into Generation Y, which is more to do with in between the millennial era there was a shift. This generation is starting to see the benefits of technology. It's starting to get more for less, getting access to more things, access to more information. And information usually means education. And that's really impacted Generation Z, which are the new generations coming into the workplace. So thankfully, there's a shift away from that robotic look and feel to a human doing more in less time. But still, if you look at the workplace today, it's basically a conveyor belt, but it's a digital conveyor belt. It's just happening on computers. So only until recently, we started to come away from that with companies like Rework, trying to make the workplace fun. And that's really because of Generation Z coming into the marketplace and starting to work and taking positions of power. But there's really no real difference between the cubicle scenario and the conveyor belt manufacturing scenario. We're still brought up and encouraged to be robots, to do more in less time. So I just wanted to get that in our heads, to us understand a little bit of a history there, because then you understand why automation has become such a big topic and how AI is going to hopefully shift us away from this mindset. One thing that I would like to do is, which may be shocking to a lot of people, even though I'm ahead of AI, AI doesn't really exist, okay? It's basically code and algorithms, just like anything else in computers and applications. If you have the dumbified brother of AI, which is RPA, behind the drag and drop interfaces that we have today in cool applications, it's code. The same thing with AI. It's code, it's algorithms, just slightly more complicated algorithms and codes. So we really have to de-romanticize this notion that AI is this all-powerful, singing and dancing thing that's going to take over the world, is going to solve all of our world problems. It's not. And it's definitely not as clever as we make it out to be. So despite that, you do need to recognize that AI is a tool, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But I just wanted to address that because Hollywood movies and everything else, and people who work in AI, they really try to make this thing look and feel like it's something, like magic, and it's not. It's just code, and let's not, make it out to be something that it's not. Despite that, AI has really done amazing things, right? A lot of people talk about AI coming, AI is coming. AI is already here. It's been here for the past 10, 15 years, and it's deeply embedded into our lives. It controls our social media, which is our new TV. Nobody watches TV anymore unless they're watching online TV. It controls the things that we see, etc. I'm not going to go over the things that everybody knows, but if it's controlling the thing that you spend hours on, it definitely has a power over you in some way, shape, or form. It's changing the way that we shop, not only at the front-end interface of e-commerce applications and websites, but on the background in logistics, transportation, etc., supply chains. Very, very soon, in the next 2 or 3 years, self-driving cars are going to be pretty much all over the place. It's a great business to have, cutting out that driver middleman. Having a car that is an asset that can earn money for you while you're at work or when you're not using it, that's going to become a big industry. AI in healthcare. Already there's been great examples of AI augmenting radiology and other imaging scans, departments in hospitals and different kinds of doctors that do that, and saving millions of lives. AI is coming thick and fast into the healthcare industry. We're going to have a lot more devices at home that we'll be able to pick up if we're going to have a fever before we have it. A lot of IoT-related devices which are going to be able to communicate with our GPs and doctors, etc. That's going to get smarter as well. Not to mention things like, which people think is far-fetched, but having drones deliver drugs to your home so you don't have to go buy it as well. That's definitely not far-fetched. There are many trials going on in many countries where that's very successful. AI classroom assistants. This is something that's already happening. It's really going to take off. Teachers not having to mark papers anymore. The curriculum becoming multiple choice and becoming digitized on iPads and screens so kids can have tailored experiences at school. Instead of going to this traditional workspace, education space where there's a medium, low, and high group, you're going to have a completely tailored education for yourself. And that's already happening in a lot of private schools today. And hopefully, that will trickle down to public government schools. AI assistants, if you look back 5 years ago and you asked Siri to call somebody, it was rather difficult. If you know how to use these assistants today, they can be very helpful. You're driving, you ask them to do a certain thing, hey, add this to my shopping list, etc. It's just a case of knowing how to use it, but they are useful in getting rid of very simple tasks. And when you start looking at IoT and the smart home, having Alexa turn off your lights and switch the mood and turn on your sound and turn on your oven and things like that, if you live in a modern home, that's very possible, and that's going to take off as well. And in the workplace, getting AI to augment our digital transformation journeys. Before, very disconnected technologies trying to work together like RPA and workflow tools, etc. Now, finally, that's coming together and is being empowered by AI. And last but not least, a lot of people talk a lot about this topic, regulation around AI, the fact that it's controlling our lives. There's a lot of trials even for facial recognition cameras on the streets to try and pick up criminals, but that's also causing a lot of trouble to innocent people as well. So a lot of rules and regulations will finally start coming in, not as just guidelines, but as actual rules that people must follow and companies must abide by, etc. So it's deeply embedded in our lives. Most of these examples are things that are happening today, and they're not exhaustive as well. There are hundreds or thousands of examples that I could give you. So what's the difference then? Why is AI so special? When you look at automation in general, and when you try to automate what you do in the workplace, you have something that everybody hears a lot about, RPA, robotic process automation. But if you think of robotic process automation as being the mouse on a computer, the ability of a bot to be able to move the mouse somewhere and click, and the keyboard being where it can make keystrokes. But the bot really has no eyes. It doesn't understand context of what it's clicking on and why it's doing it. AI is the missing piece. It's that cognitive ability to understand, for the robot to understand its environment. So I'll give you an example. If a bot is clicking on an email and trying to compose an email, with RPA, it can do that with the mouse and the keyboard. But writing an email that has context that is related to what that robot is replying to, or opening a document and reading what's in it and sending something back which has some form of meaning, will require that robot to have OCR and NLP. So if you see OCR as being the bot's eyes, and NLP being the bot's ability to speak and interpret language, those two forms of technologies are AI. So AI was really the missing piece to allow us to emulate basic human functioning. And that's why it's so special. If you just have hands by itself, it can do a lot of things, but it can do a lot of things in a very meaningless way. If you put some cognitive ability behind that, then you give the robot some basic human functionality. So if you combine the hands, the eyes, the ears, and the mouth, those are the basic things that we need in order to be human. So AI is special in that sense. It did provide that missing piece. And AI has existed for over 50, 60 years. What has enabled AI, as I mentioned there at the top, is various different stacks of technology. So things like cloud computing, in order to have more computational power, because AI needs a lot of data. Cloud storage, or even physical storage. Now, today, if you look at a 1 megabyte storage 30 years ago, it was the size of a crater. If you look at 1 megabyte storage today, or even hundreds of gigabytes, it can fit in your hand. So storage has evolved in many ways, allowing AI then to go forth and to become everything it was supposed to be. So today we don't have really, we don't have that issue with computational power and storage. We will run into those problems later, but those technologies will continue to evolve anyway. So yeah, AI finally today has been enabled by these technologies, and it is that missing piece in order for us to emulate basic human ability. So bringing all that together, the fact that AI is already deeply embedded in what we do every day, the fact that it's been enabled, it's powerful, it can scale, finally. It can work alongside other technologies, such as IoT and RPA, etc. It then has a lot of applicability. So it's a question of adoption and education now, so that companies and governments and communities can start using this stuff in order to improve what they do and to become better, more efficient, and in order to generate new revenue streams as well. So really cool graph there from a gentleman called Kai-Fu Lee. He runs one of the biggest funds in Asia for AI, one of the most respected names in AI in the world today. He did give a TED talk in 2018, so it was quite forward-looking of him, where he started to pan out what are the jobs which will be augmented by AI, which jobs are going to be taken over by AI, and which jobs will be created because of AI. And this is a graph he came up with. So if you look on the left, the tasks that need less optimization, so things like taking care of an elderly person, you need to be efficient, but it's not the most important thing. Where compassion is not needed, if you are washing dishes or if you're a truck driver. And if you look at creativity and strategy, the pinnacle of that are people who are working in the strategy workroom and in the business environment, like CEOs, etc. And his thought around this was that, well, the different segments of this will use AI in different ways. Whereas the top left will be using AI in order to help give better care to people. The top right will be using AI in order to augment decision-making so they can become more strategic. The bottom left are the poor folks who unfortunately will get their jobs mostly replaced. And the bottom right, again, it's using technology in order to gather more data in order to do their jobs better. So it's not for decision making, but it's for the gathering, improving how you gather data. So it's interesting how he has a cool outlook on life. If I want to then simplify that, going back to the theme of the discussion here, which is how is AI going to change our working environment in our societies? And by the way, the whole point of this is to do less mundane tasks over time. Forgot about that graph. If you dumbify that graph created by Kai-Fu Lee, really, if you look forward to 20, 30 years from now, if you're pessimistic, 40 years or so, there's only going to be really two kinds of jobs, and there will be a couple of jobs in the middle. So the jobs of the future are, you're either in AI and you're creating AI. So for instance, you're working at Facebook or Google, or you're working at a tech vendor which is providing an AI solution for businesses, or you're working in the government, NHS Digital, providing AI solutions, etc., in order to make healthcare better. Or you're going to be taking care of other people. You see, as healthcare improves and our working conditions improves and our environment improves, people are going to be living even longer lives than they do today, right? Japan is already showing examples of this, and other Scandinavian countries as well. So those people are going to need somebody to take care of them. And something that we've learned in the pandemic is we really value human interaction. You can Zoom somebody until you're blue in the face, but it's not the same as talking to them face to face and giving them a hug and shaking their hand. So elderly people will want the same thing. There may be a couple of robots around, elderly care homes, etc., or in the elderly home, but they're ultimately going to want people to take care of them. So there's going to be quite a big industry there as well. And the folks that work in the middle are really going to be the folks which are using AI in a creative way in order to generate new forms of businesses, or in order to generate, let's say, digital content, etc. There's a big movement now on having avatars becoming social media influencers. So that's a cool mix of AI and creativity there. And also having things such as AI versions of models, so very famous models and actors being totally digitized so they can be part of a photo shoot without actually having to be there. So that's where the gray area in the middle is, where it'll be a mixture of the two. So if you fast forward to 40 years and you see that AI is really going to take over everything that we do, if you put it together in terms of business context, it's going to generate anything between $7 to $15 trillion in economic value over the next 9 years, not 90 years. And we're talking trillions, not billions. That's more of a business opportunity than the green movement in trying to get away from hydrocarbons. So that gives you a sense of how big and how important AI is and how transformational it will be for the world. And that will then make it easier for you to envisage how really there will be two kinds of people in the world, people that generate AI and work in AI, or people that take care of other people, who most probably will be using AI in some shape or form anyway. So AI is pretty prolific. It's going to really take over everything we're doing, and it already kind of is. So I'm a little bit ahead of time there. I do want to have questions and discussions. There's a lot of questions around here. I haven't mentioned a bunch of things such as regulation. I kind of brushed over that. I haven't mentioned how AI is going to cause major cybersecurity risks. I haven't mentioned how AI can be used for doing very bad things, such as weaponized AI. So there might be questions around that. But just to close off, AI is a lot more deeply embedded than we think. I had a discussion the other day with somebody who said that automation is just it's a slightly different topic, but automation is it's just something that we use sometimes. It's a bit useless. And I said, okay, how did you get here? Oh, I landed in the airport. Okay, cool. How did you get the ticket on your phone? Oh, that was automated. Oh yeah, cool. How did you go down the stairs from the landing lounge in order to exit the building? I went through an escalator. Even that is automated. We even have our stairs automated. So I think sometimes just pause and look around and just see how deeply embedded this stuff is in your life. This is not new. This stuff has been going on for at least a decade. And because of all the enablements around it, really try to see how this stuff is going to scale, because it really is. There's a lot of commercial value in doing so. There's a lot of ethical values in doing so in order to make life better and to make things cheaper. So in recognizing that this stuff is here to stay, it's already deeply embedded, try to understand what position you play in it. Are you going to be a person who becomes a farmer, goes to live outside of society and get away from technology? If you're going to use this technology every day at work, do you think that maybe you should become a bit of a tech/operations hybrid? A person that, when faced with problems, you think of technology first and how to solve those issues that you're faced with? Are you going to stop being complacent in thinking about, oh, technology is really bad? Yes, it can be bad. But think about how you can use it for the greater good, how you can make life at home better, how you can make your scheduling of your daily life better as well. So I think a slight change in mind shift comes when you realize something is coming and there's nothing you can do about it. So you might as well, as they say, when God gives you lemons, you make lemonade. So I think when people realize this stuff is really going to take over, it allows them to make that mind shift on, okay, well, let's do the best I can out of this situation. So again, just to close out, AI is the missing piece, as I explained, to finally start copying basic human ability. And now that we have finally got this ability, can you imagine, how many things are going to get automated in the workplace? We've automated things at work which are 400 steps, processes, which require the ability to read emails, the ability to create documents, all kinds of things is possible. So a lot of the very mundane work is going to get automated. A lot of people think that's a pipe dream, but it's not. It's already happening. So then if you automate people's mundane tasks, and as we go back to that graph that I showed earlier of mundane tasks going down, and we take the robot out of the human, then what are people going to do? Right? If you look at research, you look at baby boomers, the guys who created this whole robotic movement, making us into humans, and they lose their jobs, they have an extremely high chance of going into depression, starting to drink, or starting to use drugs. 3 times more likely than Generation Y. That's because their whole sense of purpose of life has been around their work. So what I'm trying to explain here is, as the whole mundaneness of life gets automated, and we stop doing the really mundane things that we do today, we're going to be forced into thinking of what else we're going to do with our lives. And that's going to start forming and asking us existential questions of, why are we here? What's our purpose in life? Even more so than we do today. And that can cause us to go a little crazy, or it's going to propel us in order to make the world a better place, finding a lot of solutions to green movements, which are happening today, how to get rid of hydrocarbons, etc., and how to use AI for good, and also for the elderly population, which is going to really increase over the next decade or so. So if you're going to go away from this with anything, just think of, if you had nothing mundane to do anymore, how else would you use that time? And also starting to mentally prepare yourself for when that time comes, because it will come, how can you use that in a productive way so you don't go crazy? That's it for me.
Okay, well, I was sat on the side there listening to that, and it was fascinating, but also quite scary, to be honest. It pushed me back into the dark days of the pandemic, I suppose, when people were naturally at home, literally nothing to do, and people going a little bit crazy. But I think what you're saying is that's because we're conditioned to feel that we do need to be doing that. We do need to be working and pursuing these careers or jobs that might be mundane and could be slightly robotic. But Generation Z are not going to feel that same way. Is that effectively what you're saying?
It is, yeah, in a very bad way. I think, one thing that we need to look at is, we need to just start questioning things a little bit more. So that we're talking about earlier today about fake news and, for instance, in vaccines, being bad for you, etc. and just listening to influencers online, what they have to say as being gospel. We need to fact check things a lot more. So I think, a lot of this stuff is going to be a journey. It's not going to be something that happens next day. But it will come quickly enough to the point where, governments and I fear also the education system won't be able to teach us what we need to learn in order to be in a good place when this happens. So for instance, today in schools, it's extremely rare to have the topic of AI or even technology. You have ICT, but it's very basic. And a lot of things that we learn at school are things that we don't end up learning later as well. So already the education system is a good decade behind. And given that technology has an incredibly accelerated rate of change, I think it's going to always be ahead of where the education system is and where governments are for sure, because a lot of ministers and senior government officials have no idea what AI even is, never mind even putting measures in place in order to create jobs for the future. So there's a lot of things that will happen, good and bad, but there will be an adjustment period. And I just wanted to put this question in front of everybody so they can start thinking, wow, if I don't have to do all these boring things, what am I actually going to do? It starts getting people ready.
Okay, we talked there about the timeline a little bit. How long in the future are we talking here, do you think?
Well, on the quadrant that we had of jobs on the bottom left, truck drivers, dishwashers, the more basic tasks that can be replicated by a basic AI system. Those will be practically gone, at least in the more developed countries, in the next 8 to 7 years. So less than 10 years or 20 years, like a lot of people think. If you take the systems that come out of driving cars and start putting them into humanoids, which a lot of people thought was rather ridiculous by Tesla, but already there's a lot of trials for Amazon to have delivery bots. A lot of drone trials going on for delivering things as well, like our pizza or our medicine, etc. So a lot of this stuff is happening already. I think the wider question of us having less boring things to do is definitely going to come within the 20-year horizon. It won't take 30 years or 40 years or anything like that. That adjustment period will delay us by a good 5 to 8 years, I think, because a lot of jobs will go out. We're going to try to sustain the people that don't have jobs, and the government will have to catch up as well. But yeah, short answer is within 20 years we should be in a position where we don't have to do a lot of the mundane, boring things we do at work and outside of work as well. That's my prediction, at least.
Wow, okay. I still feel a little bit fascinated and scared, to be honest. So like my son is 15 years old, right? So should I be going home tonight and saying, forget everything about school? He'd probably like that. And I'd just say focus entirely on AI or caring for elderly people.
To be honest, I would do that. If I could set up a school today for my kids, I would totally do it. And it would be totally different to the school system that exists today. If you can find a school which is forward-thinking, that has technology deeply embedded into its curriculum, and who have innovation labs and things like that, of which there are some schools that do this, I would do that. I think the things that we're learning at school are, I do a lot of apprenticeship programs for young kids learning to go into technology. And the things that they're learning are just, it's not going to help them. Funny story, actually, since we're here. There was a task that was automated in one of the companies I used to work in, where people wouldn't have to crunch numbers anymore. The robot would do all the scenarios, all the different numbers. And a very senior person sat back, extremely saddened by the situation, which was a technical feat that we just accomplished. And he said, oh, God. People, I mean, how are they going to live their lives without knowing how to do mental arithmetic anymore? And it just shows you, the kind of the generational gap there is between the different generations, from baby boomers to Generation Y, etc. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. But I think if we could encourage our kids to learn about AI, that should be one of the most important topics that they learn about today.
Okay, great. Now I do have questions here, and a lot of them do address the topics that you mentioned at the end of your presentation. The first one here is, do you think there will ever be a worldwide regulatory AI board?
So that's a dream at the moment, I would say. China the East and the West work very differently on regulation. So China funds AI companies. They do the kind of the 80-20 rule, or even 70-30, I would say. They put facial recognition cameras in their streets. Everybody has to pay for things with their phone. They know where everybody is at all times. AI is deeply embedded into communities and how people live their lives. And it's fully driven by the government. And the government funds most of that. When you look at the West, especially the US, there is no real regulatory body for AI. There's an Institute of AI that has gives you kind of guidelines on what you shouldn't do and do. But it's very driven by the private sector. And if you look at Europe, it's definitely an in-between between the East and the West in terms of, I'm part of the AI Alliance team for the EU, which sets the rules and regulations for AI. It's very much, there are guidelines. There's a couple of versions of the guidelines written already of what you should and shouldn't do. But none of those are regulated guidelines that if you don't do, you're going to get fined and etc. So it's taken an in-between. That's what I meant when I said that governments are at least 10, 15 years behind in the whole AI thing. They need to do way more in terms of rules and regulations in order to avoid any potential cybersecurity issues and AI being used for wrong things like creating destruction, etc.
Yeah. I'm going to come on to that in a second, but one thing you just reminded me of there, talking about the extra leisure time that humans are going to have, is that a case for the sort of the universal basic wage that's been mooted in various places? And I think it does exist in, is it Finland? I think that's universal basic wage. So do you think that's the way that governments will have to go?
Yeah, so for those folks that work in the bottom left quadrant that I showed, they are going to lose their jobs over the next couple of years. It's not going to be more than 5 years in more developed countries. Again, governments haven't been prepared for this, so there will be a mass unemployment rate. I predicted a global unemployment rate of 15%. Don't quote me on that later on.
It's too late for that.
It's too late now. But a lot of people are going to be unemployed because of AI. Mainly because governments weren't ready in preparing their industries for the future of work. For a good decade, those people will need to have basic income provided by the government, which would then be provided by corporates, of course. I think the way the governments are going to counter that is by providing a tax for robots. So if you have 100 robots in your company doing work for you, there is Bill Gates brought this up a few years ago. Why wouldn't you tax the robots if they're providing an economic benefit to the company? They're not people, of course, but maybe there could be a special tax for companies that use robots, and that could be used in order to help people who don't have jobs. And then, during that decade where there is an adjustment period, hopefully a lot of education will be driven by corporates and governments who I hope will come into collaboration to then, provide re-education systems for people to go back into the workplace. So there will be an adjustment period. I really don't believe the future is to provide, basic government income for people just to sit around doing nothing. There's many cases in history where that created a lot of problems. As they say, in some countries, an empty mind is the devil's mind. If you have too much free time and you're earning money and you don't have to work for that money, that can turn you into a pretty bad person. So there will be an adjustment period, but I think that's definitely coming within the next 10 years. And it will take a decade to kind of wrap our heads around it, put in the regulation needed, and provide the extra tax revenue systems that will supply those people with incomes and also ability to retrain and to go back into the workplace.
Is it a bit of a utopian ideal to assume that all these people with free time on their hands are suddenly going to solve the climate crisis or become a new Shakespeare or John Lennon?
Yeah, it's a bit positive. It's a bit utopian. But I think, one thing that I think will happen because of AI as well is, this movement of minimalism. So people looking around them and saying, well, do I need all these clothes? Do I need all these things in my house? I think having more free time and having more understanding of AI and how AI algorithms work will provide people with more education to understand that a lot of their consumerism has been driven by AI, has been driven by things that are not to do with them. It's been driven by the fact that they're unhappy, that they're working 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. So I think when you get your time back, you can kind of circle back and kind of say, well, what am I doing with my life? Is this the way I want to live? And then my hope is that that will generate a good movement in order towards solving green problems, minimalism, consuming less, being more efficient with how we use resources around the planet.
Okay, are there any questions from the floor, by the way? There's a surprise. Alex Tuck, I believe, has a question. Alex.
Go easy on me.
Thank you. Thank you. Really interesting talk. My question is about the singularity. I'm going to throw it at you. What's your view on it, and do you see it coming in the same sort of time frame as Robert Kurzweil suggested?
Yeah. So singularity, for those who don't know, is the theory that robots one day will see us as mundane parts, middlemen, human beings, and get rid of us and start a war against humanity and take over. Just explaining that sounds ridiculous, so that almost answers the question. I did kind of, add a bit more theatricals to it there. But given the fact that if you tell a robot to do something without any context today or training, they have no clue what to do, that already tells you that we're pretty far away from that. Who am I to disagree with Elon Musk and those people? But he really says that it's imminent. This will happen very soon. I really disagree. I sit in the rooms. I build these AI systems with my teams. I think that like I said, AI has to be de-romanticized. There are AI systems which the algorithms tell them to think for themselves. So there are experiments where you tell a bot to learn how to walk by itself, and you give it the code in order to do that. And it takes an extremely long time for that bot to figure out how to walk. So if you go back to what I said before about AI doesn't really exist. It's just code, which happens to be algorithms. We can control what robots do. It's not going to happen, at least in the next 40 to 50 years, any risk of a robotic system taking over the world or a country or anything like that. It's all down to how we build it, and by that time there'll be a lot more understanding, education, a lot more people understand AI, a lot more regulation. So I really think there's an extremely low chance of that happening in the next at least 50 years.
Okay. One more question here. By the way, I do realise that we're running over here. It's because our next speaker, unfortunately, got stuck in traffic. If only we had AI to control traffic, then he would have been here on time.
Soon.
Or less traffic, of course. Now, with the increase of cyber attacks globally, is the developed world making itself too vulnerable through large-scale AI adoption?
So there are AI systems that attack companies, that try to hack companies. There are many ways to go through portals, etc., ports which are open, various vulnerabilities that companies have. But equally, there are AI systems that protect the company from getting attacked. So it's just a question of, making sure that the system protecting the company from cyber attacks is stronger than the one, that's attacking it. There will be cases where cyber attacks exist because of AI. Because it's faster than a programmer can try to block certain portals, etc. But again, I think equally companies would be adopting, companies who are blue chips, companies who run economies, they're going to be equally responsible in adopting it for protection as well. So it's just going to be a battle of using AI to attack, using AI to defend, and at the end of the day, it's going to pretty much cancel itself out. But in the meantime, there will be some AI-related disasters due to cybersecurity for sure.
Okay. And one final question. The weaponizing of AI, you mentioned that earlier as well. How much of a threat is that? Or is it literally a case, again, of just having better AI to protect yourself against the weaponization?
Exactly. So when people think about weaponized AI, they think of these flying drones with these bombs attached to it, and they can take out the terrorists in the crowd and that kind of stuff. It's not that. Weaponized AI is more an augmented version of a soldier, or augmented version of a plane, of a warplane. So it's a warplane, just like we have today, but that has AI systems attached to it that will allow it to be more accurate, or allow it to do certain things in cases being attacked that a human wouldn't be very good at. So dodging missiles and things like that. It's already being used. It has been used in the military for a long time, to my knowledge, from the things I've seen and the things I've consulted on. But again, it's going to be a question of rules and regulations. There are some countries that prohibit weaponizing AI already in Scandinavia. They're quite advanced in this. So it's just a question of, again, governments catching up. Do we really need that sort of system? And also, regulated bodies like NATO coming together and agreeing on a way to not use it. So I guess we're relying there a little bit on the will of the human mankind in order to stop it from proliferating. There may be a couple of dark sheep, black sheep that use it for the wrong reasons in the black market. But again, these are quite sophisticated systems to use and to maintain. So I think the chance of that happening is quite low. But yeah, it's a question of evolution and education and the government catching up and countries coming together to agree on to having anti-AI weaponry.
Okay, great. I think we'll leave it there. So thank you very much, Danilo.
Thank you.
Do you have the clicker?